Welcome, everyone, to our probably third to last CSRT meeting total of this phase of this work. It is truly the final countdown. I'm not going to sing the song. I think that we can go around and say our names of committee members, pronouns, brief visual description. Maybe we can do just that first. And then I think it'd be good to do like a moment of checking in and grounding. And we're going to talk about the rest of the themes of what we've learned in our epic, giant, ridiculous, huge review project that we did in such a short amount of time. So I will start with introductions because I'm already blabbing. My name is Shay. I use they, them, or she, her pronouns. I'm one of the co-facilitators of this awesome group. And a visual description is that my tablet is angled up at me and I have wonky lighting and there's a fan in the background and I'm a white person with a long braid and overalls and a gorgeous double chin. Somebody else can take it away from there.
I could go. I love that you started including your chin, which is just the cutest freaking description ever.
I self-identify as fat, but when I say fat, people are like, no, you're not fat. And that's the whole thing. And so I think if I just am like, I'm gorgeous and large, that's part of my visual description. And then it just like cuts it and we can keep moving.
I like it. My name is Lana Dever, and I am a light-skinned Black woman with a big head of curly hair and a lot of wood behind me, which makes it sound like finished wood cabinetry.
I'll check in. This is Kaz DeWolf, they, them, or he, him. I'm a mess, basically. I'm a white guy with shaggy hair and a black and gray winter hat, knit hat, in my bedroom. Yeah.
I can go.
Go ahead.
I'm Laura Stamis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also a white woman. I have hair that's getting pretty long, like shoulder length brown hair, and I have some doors and art behind me, and I'm wearing a scarf.
I'm Kelsey, she, her pronouns. Christmas has sort of exploded in that direction, and I know not everyone's into that, so went for the neutral background. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Maya. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently a photograph of myself because nobody wants to watch me eat dinner, but I will become live action at some point soon.
Hi, I'm Annalise Griffin. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with a bunch of brown and gray hair on top of her head in a very messy fashion. And I've got a white background and a sort of red scarf, gray shirt situation happening. I feel like it's important for to understand my mental state that in front of me is a bed covered in wrapping paper and laundry. So that's like a real scene setter that you can't see, but
Hi, this is Drift Maven. I use they, them pronouns, and I am on the phone.
I'm Bob Ozer, and I'm a all-white guy. I'm wearing a green scarf, and I'm on the phone and the video, so I'm doing belts and suspenders today. So we'll see if that works.
I couldn't hear you well, but did you say suspenders? Because if you did, I would love it.
A belt and suspenders as a metaphor for being on the phone and Zoom at
the same time.
Oh,
even better. Even better. That's even better. Okay.
Great. Welcome, everybody. Is that all of us?
I'll check in too. I'm Emily Megas-Russell. I use she, her pronouns. I am a person with white skin and I have long, curly red hair, which some people try to challenge me on, but it is red. And I have a window behind me and this pretty wild lamp plant combo. And I just want to say, I just had a moment listening to you all check in of like, I'm going to miss you in this context. I'm going to miss these meetings. They've been a staple of the pandemic season for me. So thanks for being here.
Yeah. Should we do a moment of grounding, Emily, before we?
Yeah, I would like that.
Laura, our weekly check-in with Laura. Laura's giving a thumbs up.
I'm good.
Thanks, Laura.
She's been doing so brilliantly at that task this whole time.
Yes. Great. So we start these calls off usually with a grounding practice. So you're welcome to keep your camera on or turn it off so the committee members. And everyone can join in or take this moment to do something else. Choice is yours. If you'd like to, you can close your eyes. If your eyes are closed, you can take a moment to acknowledge that when we close the eyes, we settle into darkness. Taking a few moments to reorient to that darkness if the eyes are closed. And to tune your attention inward. And part of the reason why we do this somatic practice at the beginning of the meetings is because a lot of what we're talking about is really heady. Talking in general is usually a really heady intellectual activity. And we want to acknowledge that what we're talking about is a very embodied thing. People's experiences are experiences. Safety, harm, danger. These are most often experiences that show up in our body, not just our minds. So as you take this moment to connect your attention inward to your body, orienting to the dark, see if you can find a place of light in the body. And whatever quality of light shows up, this might be a flame or a brightness, or it might be a felt quality of levity or letting go or trusting or surrendering. Whatever quality of lightness might seem available to you amidst the dark and the heavy. And if you can't quite find anything, I offer the image of a candle flame. Somewhere in the body, maybe in the belly or the heart. And taking a few moments here just to settle your breath in your body. Knowing that at any point during our meeting, you're always welcome to turn your camera off, take a break, take a moment to yourself, reconnect with the light inside of yourself or around you. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes if they're closed. taking your time to rejoin the space. And I'll take this moment to express gratitude to our ASL interpreters, Janet and Christine, along for the ride. Thank you so much for being here. Alrighty. So next on our agenda is the check-in and review of committee agreements. Which I have to pull up. Okay. I'm going to pin Janet's screen and share the agreements. And would anybody like to help out by reading the first batch?
I can read some.
Thanks.
Never do this part. Is that allowed? In the process of doing the work within the Community Safety Review Committee, we will aim to be curious, to acknowledge that we come from different places and different life experiences, to center anti-racism as foundational in this process, to center anti-oppression, including work to avoid and end racism, sexism, transphobia, and homophobia, ableism, saneism, and all other forms of oppression. Sanist oppression can look like pathologizing language, outing people's psychiatric labels, or engaging with people discriminatorily due to their psychiatric labeling or disability. Be kind whenever possible and use respectful language always. Use both and thinking instead of either or thinking whenever possible.
Thank you, Shay. Would anyone like to read the next batch?
I can read the next batch.
Thanks, Laura.
Use low, ouch, oops to pause, acknowledge hurt, and take responsibility. Acknowledge or apologize when we hurt each other, even if we don't intend harm. Hold space for probable good intentions while acknowledging that intention and impact both do matter. Welcome feedback and accountability from one another enthusiastically and give it generously. Acknowledge the contradictions.
Thank you, Laura. And I think we have one more batch if anyone would like to read. I can read them. Hold a larger vision of big intergenerational world-changing work and honor realistically the short time frame and limited scope of this one effort inside of that long arc. Be generous and reverent of people's lived experiences, especially stigmatized experiences like incarceration, arrest, poverty, homelessness, abuse, and addiction. Check our biases individually and together. Work to attune to safety, value the quality of our human experiences together, and aim to make things safer while acknowledging that safety looks different for each person and is never guaranteed. Make change in our community through both the process and the production of outcomes. And hold responsibility of confidentiality with reverence and respect respect-informed consent in how information shared is used. Does anybody have any comments or needs around our agreements?
I have a comment, which is that I've noticed this week, I looked at them this week, and the one that's hardest for me right now is honor realistically the short time frame and scope of this project, because there's so much in it and there's so much to do, and the urgency can feel so real. And also I know that urgency does not help us always make the deepest, best changes. And so I've been really balancing like showing up and doing it and not being complicit and not doing enough. And also like not, I've been up until 3 a.m. analyzing data a number of times in the last few weeks, and I've got to like honor that limited ability too. So I don't know if anyone else is sitting with those feelings around change work, but that's a present one for me right now.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Should we check in about how folks are doing, or do you? Oh.
Sorry, I just had a remembering thing I had to do to check in, which is to say to the committee that we are due for another survey, which I just realized. So I wanted to give you all a heads up before I sent it out. So I'll send it out tonight. It's going to be the same survey as you saw last time. Just wanting to hear from you all about your experiences of, I think the focus is like how collaborative and how safe the process itself has felt. So yeah, I'll send that out tonight. And if you're able, please fill it out this week. Yeah. Great.
Are there any other things that folks want to check in about before we dive into hearing from Emily first about the police review side of things, and then me a little bit more about the listening side of things?
And just to let the public know that we will make space for public comment, probably after I share a little bit and the committee discusses for the first time, and then probably again at the end.
Many of you have been here before, but the way we're trying to take public comment or your questions is you can raise your hand, the little blue hand in the participants part that looks like 2 people. Next to your name, there should be a hand to raise. And if that doesn't work, or for accessibility reasons you need to, you can ask the chat. We're going to read things from the chat back. So if you cannot completely fill the chat with text, it will help us have one cohesive conversation together. But things come up that need to go there. We'll just repeat them here, and it takes a while, but it's totally worth it sometimes. Great.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to speak for a little bit, and then I'm going to share my screen and show you all some data. But before I show you the data, I just want to share a little bit of information about sort of to contextualize the data a little bit here. So I think that, one of the things that Shay and I have been talking a fair amount about, just like how it feels to hold all of this data, much of which is, we have this really interesting blend of qualitative and quantitative data, right? We have the stories and experiences of people, the lived experiences of people, and we have the raw data that's coming through what is collected, the data points that the police department, thus far has chosen to collect and is able to provide to us. And then I've also done a number of tracers, which I will share more about, but essentially just means selecting cases and reviewing all of the documents associated with that case, which includes a lot of content about people's experiences. So in trying to figure out how to share this data with you all in the best way possible, I think one thing I just want to acknowledge starting off here is that tonight I'm going to share a fair amount of the raw data from the department. And there's something about sharing that data that feels a little bit, I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a data analyst by trade, although I have some of those skills. And so I'm not presenting this from this like sort of scientific or fully objective lens. And sort of I had this realization that a big part of what we're doing in this project here is gathering the data together and sort of presenting it back, right, to the community and primarily the select board and the community. And so there's the raw data, the information we're gathering. Then there's some data analysis that we're doing. And part of that data analysis is providing some context to the data. And then what happens with the data, how that analysis then gets applied is really to be determined in a big way, right? That's kind of the work that we're going to put into put some of it into recommendations, but what actually happens is to be determined by the select board and the community in large part as we show up for the next phase of the work to really look at how we want to apply this data. So as I was reviewing the data, I realized that in large part, the police data, the data from the Department of the Brattleboro Police Department, is really kind of in response to the question, what does policing look like in Brattleboro right now, right? Like, what do we know? What can we find out about how the police are spending their time and how resources allocated to the police are being used or applied, right? So that's kind of the spirit, the question that I think we can start to answer with this level of data analysis, data review and analysis, right? From there, we do another layer of analysis, right? To sort of say, okay, so what does that say? That especially combined with the community experiences data, what we're hearing about community members about how it feels to receive those police services and other community safety services, right? Then we can start to make some inferences together, starting in this report, but really primarily as a community to say, what should policing look like, right, in this community? So I have a fear that I'm sort of parroting back this data, much of which is intense, includes backed by really intense experiences that people have, right? The experiential end of the data. And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that, even though this part of the review is going to really be focused on the quantitative data, right? The raw numbers. But I wanted us to remember that that includes a whole bunch of experiences that people have had interacting with the police and other safety systems in this way. And what I'm doing right now is sort of referencing back to some of what is in the current draft of the report that we're writing to share with you all as well. And I want to again state that this question of like what policing should look like in Brattleboro is in my opinion the question that we are sort of embarking on asking, right, as a community. And a big, our data, our report is sort of bringing us up to speed as to right now what it does look like, right? And so we're on this precipice as a community, we're on this edge. The question of what policing should look like, and we're going to talk about this is in the report as well, is something that I think we need to think about is the history of policing, including the history of policing and the history of systemic racism and bias in policing, which is well documented and is strongly established. And also many policing philosophies, right? On the one hand, you have community policing and neighborhood watch, right? Which invokes police into a lot of community life, right? Not just criminal activity, but a lot of community life. And then you have zero tolerance policing or stop and frisk policing that really has invoked a lot of aggressive policing interventions, right? And so you have this like whole history of philosophy and also bias and racism in this institution. And I fear we are certainly not going to be able to do justice to that whole history in our report, yet it needs to be called in to be able to talk about where we're at now, right? And why we're there.
And in the report itself, it is self-evident by people's story. also, I want to say. So
Mm-hmm.
in this meeting, we need to name that, but also in the report itself, there are many, many pages of people's feelings and thoughts and experiences with policing that illustrate the way that that is happening in the community. But for Emily, she's going to talk about how policing happens, and she's going to be like, this much use of force, this much blah, blah, blah. And we need to acknowledge in this conversation, that's also there. And that's in us as the context of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're going to talk about some facts and figures, but that's the context of those facts and figures. And we can't really talk about facts and figures without that context ethically.
Right. I'm going to share one small piece of data, speak about it, and then I'd like to pause before I go deeper into some of the more complex data, primarily the use of force data. And I'd love to hear at that point the committee's thoughts on what I'm saying. Okay. So the small piece of data I want to share, and I shared this at the end of the last meeting, is that in 2019 and 2020, which is the scope, the time frame that the scope of this review focuses on, the arrest rate was between 7% and 7.8%. What that, the inverse figure of that is that 92 to 93% of police activity does not lead to arrest in Brattleboro in the last 2 years, did not lead to arrest, right? And I made a comment in our last meeting, a sort of brief comment in our last meeting about arrest rates being one indicator of the effectiveness of the use of police resource, right? And I want to speak to that for a moment. That's not that's not an opinion I'm stating. That is a tool that's used, right? And the logic behind that being that that the idea that the role of police is to protect and serve by enforcing the law and preventing, interrupting, or punishing crime, right? And the logic behind that being that if an arrest happens, that theoretically that is an enforcement action that supports that mission of the police to protect and serve and prevent, interrupt, or punish crime. It's important, I think, that we talk about the fact that, politics, legislation, and law enforcement and criminal justice are rooted in systemic racism and classism and has disproportionately affected communities of color, poor folks, and other marginalized communities negatively, right? And so it's not actually an objective black and white, crime, no crime assessment, right? And so there's this happens through formal and legal criminalization, the decision of what becomes law or then therefore becomes a crime, right? And the impact of racism and systemic oppression on those decisions, and also through informal oppression, such as the subjective enforcement or selective enforcement, right? And so, another fear I have is that our report does not adequately address, nor can it, it's not the scope of the report, right, or the review, to adequately address that whole system and the injustices at every level of that system, right? The creation of the legislation itself that determines what is a crime and is not a crime. The other elements of the criminal justice and law enforcement system, such as the state's attorney's office and the courts and the judges and the bail systems and the jail systems, right? There's so much in this larger system that I just want to make sure we are naming. Again, our review, so many aspects of those systems are not in the purview of the town, right? And so they are not subject to our review. But it does feel important to call in and name that they are also, like our lack of attention to those issues on no level is an indication of justice, right? Or a lack of need for review and accountability around the injustice. One of the reasons why I'm mentioning the 93% of police activity does not lead to arrest is because while it's likely that some of that 93% is related in some way to some criminal activity, I think it is fair to say that a large portion of what the police is responding to in our community is not related to criminal activity. Right?
Or criminalized activity.
Exactly. Thank you. Criminalized activity. Much better frame.
Well, they're both frames that people in our community hold. You know what I mean? What I'm hearing, But
so this is something I want to talk with you all about, and I really want to hear where you're at or how this lands for you all before we go further. Just this sort of, there's this one data point, right? The arrest rate and the inverse of that, which is the percentage of activity that does not lead to arrest. And consider that as we look at the steps that we may want to take as a community towards potentially reclaiming some community safety from police, that what's encapsulated in that 93% might be a good place to start, right? Looking deeper into. Again, not to say that what's happening in the criminalized or the arrest responses or the enforcement actions towards criminalized activities is not an important place for review and not an important place for justice, right?
And those parts are going to be addressed in the report in, like, for example, use of force data, and other parts of the stats that the police collect, include like who are they arresting and how are they arresting folks, and who are they searching in cars, and like things that are to arrest are also part of the review. And then there's this other piece, which is like, if 93% of what the police doing are not stopping crime exactly, then what do we do with that information? That's a pretty large number of other activity. And maybe it's helpful to show at some point soon, Emily, that information about what calls. But we could also, if anyone has any thoughts about that, this would be a moment to share. Well, how does that land that 93% of that activity?
I have a question. I have a question. So you've got the 93% that lead to no arrest.
Right.
What's the data around the percents that lead to arrest?
So 7% in 2019 and 2020. 7%. The arrest rate was 7% in one year and 7.8% in the other year.
And of that 7%, is there a breakdown of demographics?
I'm sure there is. I don't have it.
Okay. And then my other question is, 93% leading to no arrest doesn't mean that people aren't criminalized. I think I want to put that out there. I mean, that leading to going to a court case, leading to losing your job, leading to, any of the numerous other things that can happen to you when you have a police involvement in your life. So while that might sound on the surface like, oh, great, 93% leads to no arrest, it's still a lot of policing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and Kaz is saying in the chat, leading to hospitalization, absolutely. And, I would even take that a step further too, Lana, and say that I think there are many situations I would imagine where an activity, a police response might lead to consequences like what you're describing, and in fact not an arrest, and in fact wasn't actually a criminal, not only wasn't an arrest, but turned out not to be a criminal activity, right? Or a criminalized activity, right? And so this idea that 93% of police activity is not leading to arrest is not synonymous with 93% of police activity is like harmless or is appreciated or valued by those who are being responded to. Some of it is, right? Some of that percentage is actually somebody's calling for a police response that they feel then supported by. Like, we are also hearing that some people are feeling that way, right? But it's important. I think what you're saying is really important, that by having a police contact, there are other consequences that we can't measure necessarily in this review, right? I thought of that with the search data, right? Like, even just that there's the fear and the terror that people are speaking to, right? And then what happens when that unjust search, right, that maybe didn't result in any contraband, right, led to someone being late for work, right? What's the consequence of that, right? There's a snowball effect with all of these.
Or experiencing shame in their neighborhood, or experiencing like a million other consequences, and just fear.
Yeah.
Continued distrust of like the safety system being there for them when that person needs support, right? There's many consequences to any kind of authoritarian intervention, whether it's by police or mental health workers or child protection workers or anybody. And also, as a, we'll get there, but as a starting point, also in thinking about, many people are in agreement that some parts of that large percentage of police work that is not stopping crime, though that is a whole category of conversation we could have about what that means. A lot of those are places where there's more agreement about shifting who is responsible for responding to some of those types of activity. You know what I mean? Like, do police need to be responding to all manner of different calls that are not within that category? There are questions that are coming up. I see hands and I want to honor them. And I don't know who was first, but if either of you do, you should call on yourself. And otherwise, I can call on Kelsey.
Okay, I think I was first. Just a couple things. It's a little bit difficult for me to sort of conceptualize and engage in this without at least some sort of breakdown of how is the other 93% categorized? Is some of that time investigation and some of that time, right? Like how do we categorize this? Are you saying sort of, it's just like a really broad, and so it's a little bit difficult for me to engage in that conversation without a little bit more of a breakdown. And, I constantly feel like I'm straddling this line that's not always, fitting into the agenda, but it is, when you think about child protection workers and police, when we're talking about harm, like there are changes that need to happen in the system. However, there's like really horrible, horrifying things going on behind closed doors in our community with children and with folks. And so, yes, we need to like revamp systems and rethink about how we do the work. But it's really difficult for me to separate that out and not sort of want to hold respect for the fact that we need some interventions and that there are times where, there just simply isn't an option. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. But a little bit more of a breakdown would be really helpful.
I'm going to give that to you after this discussion. That's going to be next. So thank you. Yeah. And let's go to Bob, then Laura, then Kaz. I just want to pause for a moment and honor Maya's question in the chat, which is this a commonly used statistic measure, and do we have any control community? It is a commonly used statistic measure, arrest rate. And your question about control community is a great question that I don't have an answer to, but I wrote it down. Thank you. Bob?
So Kelsey stole one of my questions, which is that some of this discussion seems to be a bit almost towards analysis and recommendation, and it might be helpful to look at the data first and see what flows out of an analysis or a good look at the data. With respect to the comment that was in the chat from Maya, that 7% of police responding resulting in arrests, you're saying that that's a national statistic. Can you give a citation on that? The other 2 points, one is a minor point, mentioning that when the police arrest, one of the side effects or one of the effects of the arrest or the activity is a punishment of crime. legally, that's not true. So the question is, where does that come from the data? Punishment is actually a function of the courts.
Mm-hmm.
Then the business about the fact that a lot of the stuff that's happening here doesn't necessarily involve just the police, but involves other actors in the system, whether the legislators who make the laws, or the state's attorney who prosecute cases, the judges that sentence. I think it's important to try to figure out, where those results are, even though we might not be able to do anything about them within this context. And I think one of our objectives in terms of our agreements is to try to look at the bigger picture, even if in our small way we can't really affect that wholly. So those are my comments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would say that one place in the report that some of that information is captured is in the listening that I've been doing with people who work in other community support kind of systems, because that gives us a sense of how, we get a sense from listening to all kinds of organizations about how the state's attorney's office is functioning, collaboratively with activists, or what their commitments are to, not prosecute certain types of things, et cetera. And also in listening to folks who've shared things like, so maybe there's no formal criminalization of poverty and homelessness, but what does it look like if you're sitting in the waiting room at the court and the entire docket could be an overlap with a client list of an organization that serves the poor, right?
Mm-hmm.
What does it look like if we have a formal agreements to not ever discriminate, and yet the listening data really shows that the felt experience of policing is radically different between different kinds of folks. So a little bit of that context will come out in my side as well. And I think, Emily, I do think it would be helpful for you to give some more information to folks before we dig into analysis, because it seems that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Potentially, if that works for you.
Yep. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could even put my question on pause and wait until we get more of the data analysis, for sure.
And Kaz has a question in the chat that's about what criminalized means to us. Have we discussed the definition of that? It seems to me that anytime non-criminal behavior leads to police involvement, that seems like an act of criminalization. Maybe mad folks and psychiatrically labeled folks find our distress criminalized when it leads to police intervention and loss of freedom, despite no crime having been committed. Absolutely.
Right.
And we don't as a larger culture talk about spaces like the retreat as a prison. And yet functionally, if you laid out the functions of each of those institutions, they're very, very, very similar. And many people in those systems do talk about inpatient treatment as psychiatric incarceration. And that is a form of criminalization, frankly. That's very valid questions, Cass.
Yeah. So did you want to say more, Kaz, or was that?
I think it's sort of been said just now. I think Shay sort of said something along those lines a minute ago, just that there seems like there's practices and systems that create things that are functionally criminalized, even if they aren't actually on the books as criminal activity.
Right.
And that tends to be marginalized folks. Their lives become functionally criminalized. Yeah.
Right. Right. And I think it works in the and this is some data analysis work, but the opposite is that it feels similarly reflected, which is that, for example, something that might technically be considered illegal or a crime that happens when somebody doesn't have a home and therefore is in a public space and more visible, right? Those who have the privilege of a home and can do those things in private becomes functionally less criminalized or uncriminalized, right? And so that
which is
works.
also reflected in the listening, where tons of white people were like, I do stuff all the time that I know people are getting punished for.
Mm-hmm.
Frankly, like, you know, the amount of, you know, many statistics are well established about young white people on drug use, for example, being radically less criminalized than people of color and people on the street for doing a similar thing. So I hear that.
Maya is adding some research, I assume she just did, which is very helpful. Burlington PD made approximately 1,600 arrests in 2019 of 28,000 calls, 17.5%. So a much higher arrest rate per that note. And she said she'll send a citation. So one of the reasons why I wanted to pause and have a conversation is because while I totally agree and appreciate that more of the data will be helpful before we start discussing analysis and certainly recommendations, these kinds of questions are helpful. I don't have much more time to do much more data gathering or analysis, but I want to also acknowledge that I was not able to analyze all of the data per the scope of this project, right? Shay and I put in many more hours than we were budgeted to or will be paid for. And still, we were not able to actually adequately analyze all of the data that one would need to in order to gain the degree of understanding that we're talking about, right? And so what we can do is include those questions as further inquiry that needs to happen as part of the, like, this is just one phase of the work, right? And some of it I can do, like this I can certainly do, right? And I can likely get demographics on arrest data, right? So that's why I want y'all to chime in with questions about the data so that we can fill it out with more answers, or at least more questions, right? The data sometimes asks more questions than it answers, and that's actually quite normal. And so,
can I make a comment as well about? Sorry about that. I muted myself for a second. I want to just bring us back to, for a moment, the idea that the data is never an accurate representation of the lived experiences of marginalized people. They don't show up in that data. So even if you talk about, 93% leading to no arrest, 7% resulting in arrest, well, you're talking about a very small percentage of the population that is constantly, being represented in arrest and not being represented in data in other ways. And so in that, I think that the listening data, to call that data, is more important, because oftentimes when we talk about, like, even the word data sounds oppressive to me because it isn't collected. The things that we are talking about are things that are not collected. And those are, that's where we're going to get our picture.
Totally.
People have shared that. Like, I tried to change it and it never happened. People don't listen to me. Like, I named my experience and I don't think it got collected or addressed is a theme among communities and not others, unfortunately. And not surprisingly. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. And to follow up on that too.
Listening information as data or not, Lana, as partly due to feedback that we had in the last meeting about science, and also conversations that I've had with other folks about qualitative work. It's about, what my job is to draw the constellation. People are the stars and people's experiences are the stars. And our job is to draw the picture in between and to contextualize the information that the town already had, could have, or this information exists out there. We didn't create it. We pulled it in like sourdough, pulling in what's in the air, and we're creating this picture of a new thing. And that picture shows that people's experiences are not being captured in policy, that the practices are different than policy is different than practice in a experienced way. And that regardless of this, like, even if it was just the listening piece, I feel like we would be compelled to make significant change. And hopefully the policy, I told Emily, like, her part in some ways is less glamorous of holding this than mine, because the piece that I've been holding is just like the lived experience truth of people. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's just what people have experienced and what they want. And Emily is like doing this very pragmatic work to like try to see what is, and then we can like use that to like determine the actual steps to the next thing. You know what I mean? And the part that I have been holding is just like, what's the next thing? What do we need? And we're just going to run toward it. Right. And so this data part is important for us to hear, because it may lead us into those very next immediate steps in terms of like what is, possible. And it could be that there is an argument to be made that if the police's stated goal is addressing crime, whether or not we agree with that goal, any of us, some functions of their work that are not addressing crime might be very easily given away. And some police agree with that, right?
Yeah.
And some service agencies agree with that. And that might be one space to go. And it is a dangerous argument. And I honor the complexities that everyone's bringing up in that dangerous argument.
I want to point that out as well. I mean, I love what you just ended with, Shay, because it brings me back to what Kelsey was saying about sometimes needing the police to come and address harm. And I just want to pose the idea that how can the person who shows up and terrorizes your family with a gun can then come and save you when you're in harm? That situation is traumatizing for children. I can tell you, as from lived experience as a child, having police show up with guns to my house was traumatizing and terrifying. Mm-hmm. And no healing came out of that. And they certainly weren't able to rectify situations because they're not equipped. Their tool is a gun. That is what they use. Their tool and their methods are for policing criminal activity, policing poor people, and they will never be able to save those children, or save those battered women, the same ones that they see as criminals. Mm-hmm. And there are better people who are more equipped to do that in our community.
I hear what you're saying, and I don't necessarily think the police officer showing up is going to stop a child from being sexually abused. However, there's an investigation that needs to happen when child discloses or various things happen. And, that's the police, right? There are various facets to the work that do lead to protection. And as much as we need resources, preventative work and restorative justice, it's hard for me to get on, fully centered with that we don't need some level of protection and accountability when real harm is caused. And there's real harm going on behind closed doors. We just can't escape that. Hopefully we can make some changes in how we do this work to minimize that. But I also just wanted to say, my understanding is we have tonight and we have Wednesday to talk about the findings, and we're supposed to be part of the conversation of recommendations. And this conversation is so important, but I'm wondering, are we going to be able to look at that a little deeper of what kind of where you are and the findings? And
yes, we are hoping to, if we can, we're hoping to start that conversation tonight about recommendations. But these are our findings. We're sharing them with you now.
However, you have only shared one data point, Emily, so far.
Exactly.
I feel like we maybe can pause dialogue,
totally,
get into some more of what you have. And I think that might make the next phase of convo a little smoother.
Great. Thank you all for this. I mean, there's just so much to talk about. And so, we aren't going to be able to get to all of it, but it does feel really important to hear from folks. So I'm going to pin the interpreter, who is Christine right now, to the screen, and I'm going to share my screen.
What I know from speaking with Emily endlessly over the last weeks is that there is a lot of information. She's reviewed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents and policies and statistics. And so I feel like a trust in what's happening, but I do understand that needs to be shared with you all if you're going to be able to participate in conversations about recommendations.
And I also thank you for saying that, Shay. And I also want to respond to you, Lana, and say that, there's some context in the report that will acknowledge and provide resources for folks to learn more about how the field of data science itself is a field that is deeply racist, and how not just are a lot of people's experiences, especially marginalized people's experiences, not represented in the data, but sometimes it's overrepresented in the data, which is what we see here. And that overrepresentation in the data actually leads to policy decisions, right? And so it all sort of affects each other, right? And the listening, and I also agree that what is more important and needs to be more centered is the listening data. So the fact that this was my task doesn't reflect an allegiance necessarily to one type of data over another. Okay, so we talked about this briefly last week, but I'm just showing you this chart, which is, these are the top. So to answer somebody's question, I think maybe Kelsey's, about what's going on in that 93%. What's going on in all of police activity are, the police are organizing their activity when they, through the data points into certain codes, right? Dispatch puts a code in, right? It's called a nature code. And then the responding officer puts a code in, which is the offense code. Sometimes matched, sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes what came in to dispatch with the information they had turns into something else when the responding officer addresses it. Okay, but these are the most common call types, right? So the nature codes from dispatch, right? We talked about this last week. 15 to 16% is the suspicious person code, right? The next most common code is the animal problem code, which I got clarity from the captain that this includes anything from my neighbor's dog pooped on my lawn, to there's a herd of cows in the road that won't move, to there's a skunk with rabies, so, and there's a citizen animal control officer whose responsibility when on duty responds to these, and then otherwise the police. The third most common code is agency assist. This is important, I think, and it demonstrates some formidability and strength between different safety response agencies in the police in our community, right? Then trespassing violation, then welfare checks, and then public speaking engagement, which I did clarify is situations in which the police are asked to or initiate contact with schools, classrooms, senior service centers, essentially community policing. So these are the 6 most common call types, right? There's 3 more pages of codes, right, that I have the percentages on. And most of them are very small, right? So, 1.7%, 3%, things like accidents, false alarms, intoxicated person, juvenile problem, missing person, noise disturbance, traffic hazard. There's a lot of different codes, but what I'm reporting to y'all here are the 6 most common call types. Okay. I just shared this with you, the arrest status. So in 2019, the Brattleboro police responded to 10,000, were essentially dispatched to 10,626 calls. Year to date, as of 12/8 in 2020, the Brattleboro police were dispatched to 7,874 calls. And that shows a 7% and 7.8% arrest rate. This table shows the arrest rate for just these 2 offenses. The offense codes. So the welfare check offense code and the PSC offense code. Now these are offense codes. So the responding officer is putting this in. And in 2019, 2020 total, right? We had 968 welfare checks. 9 are still active, so they're not completed for any number of reasons. 14 ended in arrest. So that's a 1.5% arrest rate. Right. And then for suspicious activity, which is 16%, about 15 to 16% of what the police are responding to, we have a 6.5% arrest rate, quite low, right? Okay. Any comments or questions about that data? Again, I'm not inferring anything from that data yet. I'm just sharing with you what it says before I move on to use of force data, which is a lot more complicated than what I've shared with you thus far.
Emily, do you have a few examples of an agency assist?
Yeah, so a really common one from just the handful of the tracers I've done is like the BMH calls for somebody who's in the ER, right? That they need police, they feel they need police support with, or the HCRS crisis team, or a school, and very often, more often like schools that serve populations of folks, specific populations.
I will note that the retreat does not use
Yeah.
almost any
Right.
police. They used to. There's some action about that, and they don't anymore. They use internal support, which also receives terrible reviews in the listening section. I just want to say, of torture, and people use the word. We didn't seed the answers of the listening section. We were like, "What was your experience like?" And I categorized people's answers, and torture was a common word used to describe that. But the BMH also, I just want to say, has security on staff as well, in addition to police, and police are still called in. So there's a lot of information that we can't get into right now, but
yeah. Bob?
So is it fair to say then that the 7% arrest statistic is related to the number of suspicious activity calls as opposed to all calls?
Because the arrest rate of suspicious activity calls is 6.5%.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. I think that because the percentage of, I'm going to share my screen again. Sorry. Now we have Janet interpreting. Okay. So, this 6.5% is 128 arrests out of 2,071, suspicious activity or person contacts, right? And then, so that's an arrest rate based on the total number of that suspicious activity code, which is about 16% of total codes, of total police responses. So my brain isn't able to sort of determine then what the correlation would be to that, like if can you restate your question?
I can try. You do have a recording, so.
Yeah, sure.
So the 7% of all calls resulting in arrests, and the arrest rate would be 7% for those calls. It seems that the calls that we're focusing on are the suspicious activity calls, primarily, that would result in 7% being arrested.
I don't think so. I think that of suspicious activity, it's like 16% of total calls are suspicious activity. Of that 16%, 7% of those result, 6.5% of those result in enforcement action or an arrest, right? But I don't think the correlation
Not that they
made to that 7% total arrest rate of all calls, because there's still 74%, 74 to 75% of police contacts that are not suspicious activity calls that make up some of that 7% arrest rate. Does that make sense? But I think these are just, these are the only two codes I have drilled in arrest rate data, right? Domestic violence is handled differently than this, right? So domestic violence is a circumstance code, and it's a code that's usually used further down the line once that it's per my understanding, it's used in mostly situations that result in a domestic violence related arrest, right? So the arrest rate of that code is very high, but that's not an indication necessarily. That's an indication of how that code is used, right? A lot of situations that might involve domestic violence might come through as a citizen dispute or disorderly conduct or or suspicious activity or as something else. So it would require a deeper analysis to understand how those I did do a few tracers on it, but it would require a deeper analysis to understand how those cases they're not coming through super clearly from the beginning, right? As a domestic violence case.
Because those aren't coded at the dispatch level.
Right.
As like, this is the type of situation that somebody calling for any number of, speaking about it in any number of ways, and then it gets coded after it's been responded to, essentially.
Right.
So all of this data that we're talking about right now is all in some way, whether it's someone calling the cops on their neighbor or whether it's someone who's saying, I have a rabid raccoon in my backyard, come help, which seems like a valuable service. These are all things that the community has asked for in some way or shape. But is there a separate set of data for actions initiated by the police, like traffic, or say an officer is downtown and sees someone, I don't know, urinating or stealing something or murdering someone in the middle of the street? Separate set of data that we have like comparable numbers for?
Good question. No. Yes and no. So traffic stop data is different. And the department itself has some traffic stop data. And also we have the study that I referenced last week that was done throughout towns all over Vermont and Brattleboro as well, that analyzes traffic stop data. So that is different. But situations like you're describing where a police officer may see something suspicious, for example, would be represented in this data, right? So not all of the data, for example, that I'm showing you up here is somebody called the police, right? It may be that, for example, there was a search warrant, right? That's not a dispatch initiated contact. Or if a police officer, sees something suspicious or initiates contact, it goes through and is coded as an offense code in the system. So that data would all be represented here. And so it's, that infers the question of, can we determine, data that is initiated by dispatch, call to dispatch versus data that's not. And I'll write that question down. I'm not sure that that's possible, but it might be.
People may have more questions about the specific set of information that Emily shared. I also want to be really mindful of the time. And I'm wondering, Emily, if you want to do like a skeletal rundown of like the types of information that you like just super
left.
Of like what else you analyze, because I know there's so much, and also any like themes that are emerging for you in your analysis, because I also want just to talk about a little bit more about listening for a moment, and talk a little tiny bit about sort of themes of types of recommendations at the very end, to give you all something to think about before our next meeting.
So the next chunk of data that I would like to show you all is data on use of force, the use of force data, which I've spent a lot of time with. And before we do this, I just want to say that this data is intense. I think even the numbers are intense, frankly, and may have an emotional impact. And I just want to give a little bit of a warning on that. And then I have a direct question to the committee about how to handle a specific piece of this part of the review. I'd love some guidance from you all.
Do you feel able to give a rundown of the types of information that you have?
Yes, before doing the use of force, you're saying?
Yeah, what I'm hearing from folks continues to be, we can't analyze things or answer your questions until we understand what your review is, and this is our only opportunity to hear from you about your review. And so I wonder if just like the outline names of the types of things that you have shared would be helpful. And then I definitely think it's relevant for you to ask questions of the committee about use of force data. Use of force is obviously named by people who receive it as violence often, and it's really relevant to the kind of conversation that we're having. But I think it might help to zoom out for just a moment.
Yes, and I have, okay, so the document review included a full review of the department's policies and procedures, documents used in supervision and performance review, investigation documents, MOUs, the trainings attended by officers in 2019 and 2020, every complaint and the department's response to it in the last 2 years. The data reviewed included data that the department captures on arrests and traffic stops, welfare checks, overtime usage, response to bias-motivated incidences, use of force incidents, dispatch call numbers, and law incident reports by code. I also reviewed some data from HCRS, from the Police Social Work Liaison. The department does not capture data specific to this program. And I reviewed all documents related to, I did tracers on 17 incidents. Most were use of force. Actually, I did 17 use of force incidents. Then Bob and I did a handful of other suspicious activity and welfare check incidents. The 17 use of force documents were many, many, many pages of documents. So that's every document associated with each case, 17 different cases. Tons of content in there that is super important, and I don't know how to handle the privacy issue related to that. And that's kind of what I want to talk to you all about a little bit and get your thoughts on. So that's the data that I analyzed or reviewed, the documents and the data that I've analyzed in this review.
So like not only data about arrest and use of force and things like that, but also policies as they measure up against some of this information, including cases. And I heard you say training, what kinds of training?
Yeah.
Amount of training. And you said a lot of other things really quickly, but I wonder, are there any, no, it's beautiful. Are there any themes that have emerged from that you feel able to share with the committee?
Yes.
Or not? It's okay. I understand so deeply.
Yes. No, I feel able to share some.
Emily and I have shared that this process is kind of like writing a thesis, like finals or a thesis, but your professor is your community and the newspapers are tracking your progress of the draft, and you don't get a grade at the end, like your community's well-being is better or worse. And so I understand the vulnerability of sharing things before they're totally done, but
no, I'm happy to share.
And I just want to say, again, thank you so much. And I understand this project has been so huge for you, and I appreciate if you could share whatever you can, because we can't really have dialogue about it if you can't share these themes with us,
Totally. I'm happy to share themes. Yep, absolutely.
And I'm sorry, did you say numbers in there about what was the percentage of use of force?
I haven't shared the use of force data yet. I was just asked to share like what I've reviewed first before going into use of force data. But I really want to share the use of force data with you. That feels like one of the most important things. But Shay is asking me to share themes from the other data. The main thing I want to share.
And you can challenge me, Emily, at any time. I always welcome challenge. I just feel like I'm hearing this, like, I don't even know how to like take in this information, because we really need to see like, what is your review been about? Right.
So before I share about the use of force data, I'll just share that we've talked a little bit here and there about the CPCC and citizen complaints, and that is going to be a part of our report, and potentially, pending further committee discussion, a part of our recommendations. And one of the biggest findings, which I think I shared a little bit about already, is that the CPCC meets, monthly at most, sometimes skips months, particularly in this year, which has been wild for everybody. And the meetings are about 30 to 45 minutes long, and that their scope is really specific to individual kind of mediation, right, between the person, the complainant, and the police, and that they don't intend to do accountability work or review trends in the complaints. And the complaints, as I mentioned last week, I think, are really the only place that we have any data, and I would even hesitate to call it such, on like bias motivation on the police's behalf, right? We talked about this last week. So this is a big gap, essentially. Like the trend here is that there's a huge gap in community accountability or community control, really, of the police and the experiences that people have in the police department. So, you know, the CPCC is really not, you know, providing an accountability and per their own, you know, scope,
And have
what their
thanked us
scope
for
is.
but we're a very temporary body.
Right.
So
Right. So that's one theme. You know, there's a huge emerging theme, which we've, I think, talked about, but not in a really super concrete way, which is that welfare checks are a significant, you know, part of what the police are doing, are very, 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 very most often not related to a crime being committed, right? And to Kaz's point earlier, are effectively being criminalized. And that there's a lot of, you know, report in our community listening data about how that experience feels like. There's also a lot of data in from the tracers, which is really just meant to illustrate kind of like the police response, that the police presence, a uniformed armed officer, has a strong potential, one could even say almost always, is going to escalate a situation, right? And so I think the police participation in mental health and emotional, sort of psychic, spiritual states that folks need support around is like one could even say well-intentioned, right? And from the spirit of community policing, and has, you know, the data that we're finding on all ends of this indicate that it's the impact is negative overwhelmingly, and that it's an area that I think there's agreement as well culturally among folks in different realms of that work, that it's not really working as it is, and we need to find a different system. So that's one major theme that the police review data also supports. And then there's racial trend data that we mostly are seeing emerge in the traffic stop data and in the use of force data. So that's what I'd like to show you next.
thank you, Emily. I think that's really helpful.
Lana, did you want to say something, or?
I was just thinking about what you were saying, and I wanted to add to that, you know, people of color are now so afraid of the police when they're stopped or when police come to their house, afraid they're going to lose their lives. That it definitely escalates things. I mean, you know, you've got a teenager or a young person who's in extreme fear, and then you've got an armed police officer who's looking for a crime, and that's just never going to go well.
Right.
Or who thinks that he's not looking for a crime, and that there are a lot of themes that are emerging that tend to infer that there's functional criminalization and formal criminalization, and that functional criminalization means that even if a police officer is restraining someone and taking them to the retreat where they're going to be strip searched and put in a locked ward, that's also being experienced as incarceration without a trial to people who are experiencing that. So, and that's happening to people of color disproportionately. It's also happening to MAD and psychiatrically labeled and psychiatrically disabled people, and people with mental illnesses. That's a theme that crosses that all of the information that we have supports that even people who work in those systems feel like that response is not really working, and that we need to address policing and mental health response.
And then I want to say about the training in terms of themes that emerged is, you know, 2020 has been a wild year for all kinds of reasons. And the sheer number of hours that the police have spent in trainings is much less than in 2019. I think for a number of reasons, including lack of training opportunities due to the pandemic. But I will say that so in 2020, the police received a total of 375 hours. That was number of hours of training offered, not multiplied by number of officers that attended those trainings, if that makes sense. Almost all officers did receive some diversity, equity, inclusion, and bias training, which totaled 9 hours, right? And then there's I'm going to share my screen here. There's a list of the trainings that occurred. In 2019, there was not bias and inclusion DEI training. And it's important to note because I think there's a perception that this has been happening and has been happening for longer, and maybe 2019 was a fluke, but it was not a part of the training protocol in 2019. These are the mandatory trainings that are attended by all officers in 2020. And then below are the mandatory trainings that are attended by almost all officers. All the other trainings that I did not list in those were attended by like one officer. Most of the other trainings were attended by one officer. Some of those trainings were attended by, 3, 4, 5, 6 officers. But I think officers are able to sort of like do development as needed and either assent to or choose trainings. I will include in the report, and I have documented down further here that there's a lot of evidence, as we talked about in our last meeting, that sensitivity training and bias training is not effective. And we can talk more about this when we talk about recommendations later, but I think maybe later this week. But I think that we have to consider the department's actual readiness for bias and inclusion training, which I think really needs to be assessed. The perceptions of training around bias and the actual data, and then the implications of that data, which we see, the actual data on training, and then the implications of the integration of that training on the bias data that we're looking at, I think needs to be discussed, if that makes sense.
Meaning, is there any measurable relationship between training and a reduction of racial disparity in policing?
Right.
And if there is, then maybe it's worth exploring that. But if there's not, then that, I think that the training budget increased by 48% in this year.
And to speak to that, how could it be if not every officer even went to it? What are they going to get the training through osmosis?
In 2020, the diversity, equity, inclusion training and the implicit bias training were mandatory. Every officer did go to it. And it was those two trainings totaled 9 hours in the year. And the data just demonstrate, like the national data, folks who are analyzing how effective bias training and DEI training is, demonstrates that, frankly, the formidability of how unconscious our biases are overrides that sort of small impact of that 9 hours of training very quickly. The data seems to show that after an hour or immediately after the training, there's some positive impact, reduced bias, but that actually goes away. 2 days later, that's gone. Hours later, it's gone, right? The unconsciousness of how unconscious and how, frankly, historical this bias is sort of can easily override any investment in training, right? And that's why I think really assessing readiness and receptivity among the department to looking at bias, not just being trained on bias, but actually a commitment to reducing bias is something that we want to consider recommending.
Do we, just a quick question on training. I know that in order to maintain their badges, they have to engage in certain trainings. And then the department sometimes does additional ones that they just choose to implement at different points. But I'm assuming you don't have all the information right now, but do we have a sense of the trainings and the minimum required that they did? Are they the sort of state mandated required virtual modules, and how many of them were, what sort of framework was the training? Was the question.
Yeah, it's a good question in terms of like, what's the philosophy or where the, what I just showed you is the list of the mandatory trainings.
I'm absolutely hearing everybody that the data is showing.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'm hearing the point is that the data is showing that trainings are not leading to prolonged shifts. I was just wondering, like, are we talking about virtual modules or like, I was just wondering what sort of training. Okay, thank you.
Right. So you see a 7-hour equity, diversity, creating a welcoming community, and a 2-hour implicit bias training. And right, like I did not go further to analyze who's doing these trainings, what they're including, where the requirements for them are coming, how they're getting selected. That I think could be a recommendation for further review.
And I can
So
say
I'm
that
jump.
information, it implies that there's a desire for that to be part of the like increased accountability potential area of recommendation. Right. That I would say accountability might be like a header of a recommendation field, and that might include some further inquiry. And also, some community members have said, if any body is naming accountability as a goal, then we can't just make promises. Accountability, even interpersonal accountability, right, means that we're accepting feedback, and we're thinking about like what the other bodies present need from us, and we're like finding our relationship there. So it may be that the community having more input and transparency and understanding about what that training relationship looks like could be a recommendation, or something in that field could be a recommendation that we can talk about next meeting.
Yep, totally. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into the use of force data, and this is data that comes from a spreadsheet, effectively, that's managed by the department itself. And there's, I think I certainly have some recommendations around improving the accuracy and integrity of how that data is captured, just in terms of the consistency with which we're using the same language is used. And so that will be included in the report. Some of those sort of smaller recommendations around gathering data. It's important to. So in 2019, there were 77 incidents in which police responded. Police response led to use of force. And so at a total of 10,626 police responses. That is, if everything is, if that data is accurate, then 0.7% of the incidents involve some use of force. Now, the Brattleboro Police Department includes handcuffing. Anytime they use handcuffs as a use of force, which I understand to be a low threshold. Like, in other words, some other departments don't include handcuffs don't consider it use of force. So that's just important information for y'all to know. And there was an average of 2.9 officers responding to a use of force call, right? So some involved just one officer and some involved many officers. There were 17 different reporting officers listed on the use of force spreadsheet for 2019. Of those 17, 2 officers were listed on one case. 4 officers were listed twice. 3 officers were listed 4 times. 3 officers were listed 5 times. 1 officer was listed 6 times. 2 officers were listed 7 times. 1 officer was listed 8 times, and 1 officer was listed 9 times. So this is the responding officer, the reporting officer, right? So to sort of note that backwards, there was an officer who was in 9 out of those 77 incidences. They were the responding officer. Okay. In 18% of the use of force cases, a suspect sustained injuries, and in 12%, an officer sustained injuries. I breezed over this, but it's important to note that in 2019 and 2020, there was no incident in which a firearm was used. That is not true of Brattleboro history. There have been incidents beyond the period of review that we are looking at in the last 10 years, including that have led to the use of a firearm. But in the last 2 years, 2019 and 2020, there have not been instances in which a firearm has been used.
They have been drawn in that time, and
yes. Yep. They have been drawn, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So what we have here, I'm going to switch out the pinning of the interpreter and pin Christine's video here. Okay. For some reason, it helps me to say that out loud. Okay. So what we have, the reason this is rainbow color coded is simply to show you that we're looking at different columns that show different data. So the green column shows call type and the percentage of use of force incidents, the charge and the percentage of use of force incident, the type of force used in the percentage, and the sex and race data and the percentage. So these asterisks just essentially say that these percentages will not equal 100 because many actually of the incidents have more than one call type and or more than one charge and or more than one type of force used. Okay. So 29% of the use of force incidents were assaults. And what I want, you can see the data here. I want to draw our attention to 8% of them were in situations in which the call type was for a suicide attempt or a suicidal person. And 3% were mental health. And this other 33%, there's a note at the bottom, which you'll be able to read more about later, of the different types of call types that are represented. But I put in the data for the ones that are most represented.
So just to be clear,
yeah,
out of when they were called for someone who was suspected to be suicidal, 8% of the time, force was used on the person who was suicidal.
No, thank you for asking that. So out of the 77 incidents in which force was used, 8% of them, the reason the police responded was suicidality, right? So it's not the inverse in that out of all suicidal or out of all call types that had to do with suicidality, force was used. It's that out of all incidences in which force was used, 8% of those involved suicidality. Does that clarify, Lana? Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Another, if this isn't clear already, the yellow highlighted boxes are the ones I kind of want to draw your attention to the most, right? So this is charges. Out of all use of force incidents, 25% were charged with disorderly conduct. 25% there was no charge. There was no charge or no arrest, but use of force was still used. And then we have other numbers here. 17% there was an assault charge. 13% there was a resisting arrest, that is. 10% there was a possession charge. 9% there was a violation of conditions charge. And then there's other charges that are sort of looped in together in this other 24%. And again, that somebody could have a trespassing charge and a possession charge and a violation of conditions charge, right? Okay.
Can you just tell us what head displacement is? Because
Yes.
It sounds terrible, and I'm sure it's not as terrible as I'm imagining.
I don't know a ton about it other than to say that it is, for example, in a tracer that I read, it was used for somebody spitting at an officer, at a rescue person, right?
But what is it?
Using
like
force to move the head in some way. It's a weird word because it sounds like you're literally displacing the head.
So like maybe move their head and turn it or something?
I think the tactic, I don't know a lot about the tactic itself. Right. Yeah, that's
Moving
a good
on.
question. That's a good question. So moving on to the types of force used, though, 82% of the use of force cases involved a hand containment. It's usually a handcuff. It's not always, though. Grabbing a hand or a wrist is also hand containment. And then 23% head displacement, 17% firearm drawn, right? 5% taser drawn, 4% taser aimed, 3% baton drawn, 3% knee strike, 3% probes, which is the taser that shoots probes, and then 3% empty impact, which is like a not using a weapon or a tool, but using a hand impact. 3% baton strike and 0% firearm used. And there's a note here that says that 82% of the use of force cases involve containment. The remaining cases, 18%, in which hand containment was not used, the use of force used in all 10 of those, in 10, this is wrong, in 10 of those 14 cases was firearm or baton drawn. So if the use of force, most of the use of force cases that didn't involve handcuffs, the use of force that's being reported is firearm or baton drawn, right?
So I have a question again. I'm so sorry. I keep getting lost.
No, this is very confusing.
Data.
This is very confusing.
But is there, so one of the methods of restraint that's come to the foreground recently has been knees on necks as a way of restraint. And I don't see restraint here at all.
Right. So I
find it hard to believe that our police officers don't restrain anyone. So what would that be under?
I mean, hand containment can be grabbing somebody's hands.
Yes. Yeah.
And
right.
Is containment and restraint are related.
Yes.
Right. And so
this is my part of the review, but that.
Right. One of the things that they're thinking about doing in different places now is eliminating that type of restraint and no longer allowing officers to use it. But that would be a little bit difficult here when it's not specifically listed as a thing.
Yep.
I was just going to say, I think that when the chief and captain presented to the select board, they said that I don't know the exact term for it, but the neck restraint is not something that they use, that it's not, correct me if I'm wrong, Emily and Shay, but I'm pretty sure they said that's not on the list of approved tactics already.
Thank you for that, Kelsey.
I have the same felt sense that I wouldn't share in a court of law, but I feel like they said that as well.
Yeah. And I'll inquire further about your question, Lana. Thank you. Yeah. Another piece of data I really want to show y'all is this sex and race data, right? So 50% of use of force cases, the subject was male, and 42% female. The reason that doesn't equal 100 is because some are not reported if there's multiple subjects, right? They don't report sex and race data if there are multiple subjects.
And they're just binary. It's just female, male. There's no. Okay, that I can see as a huge glaring issue.
Yeah,
just right off the bat.
That's actually a overall theme in all of the data and policies and procedures. That will be represented as an overall theme in the data. 17%.
I could say that the police have inquired about how to have ever inquired about how to document that more respectfully. But I still think it's you're right, but it's still an absence of information about the relationship of police to queer and trans people in a general way.
Yes.
I find it to be hilarious that it would be a question as to how to document it. Sorry.
I have never been tasked with answering that question. And I
ask someone and then write it down.
Right. It is an invisibilizing part of the data and again the policies that absolutely will be recommending change around. Bob Ozer is saying in the chat that the police chief did say on 11/24/2020 that chokeholds are against policy. Okay, so again here we see that 17% of the use of force cases, the subject identified was black, right? And that's an assessment of the person inputting the data, right? This is a much higher number than the percentage of the Brattleboro population that identifies as black. And I did do tracers on a random sample of cases in which the subject's racial identity is listed as black. But this is a piece of data that I think we need to, this is a racial disparity in the data. I'm going to show you the same data for 2020. So in 2020, there were 40, year to date 20, which is up to 12/14. There were 47 incidents in which police responded to using use of data, less than 2019, partially at least
Use of force,
like
not use of data.
use of force data. Thank you. Partially due to the pandemic, I imagine. And so this ratio is 0.5% of incidents in 2020 in which use of force, the police use force. 3.3 responding officers, and there's a breakdown, as I did earlier. There are 14 different reporting officers in the breakdown of how many reported to how many of the incidents. The suspect sustained injuries from use of force in 17% of the cases, and a police officer sustained injuries in 8.5% of the cases. So
it would be so helpful to see this information as a per capita, as opposed to the way we are looking at it, because the numbers look so small, but we're such a small community. You know, so it's hard to see how it's proportioned and disproportioned in this way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think the relative smallness of the percentages, similar to the relative largeness of the percentages in the traffic stops data, should not, I believe, needs to be addressed and spoken about, and also should not reduce the legitimacy of the data that we are seeing represented within that data, right? So within the data we see here, 13% of use of force incidents involve a subject who is Black, right? And then we have 6% of use of force incidents in which somebody is experiencing suicidality. And then we have 23% of incidences that involve use of force that don't actually involve a charge of any kind. You know, out of the tracers, and then we have, 85% involve hand containment, and then 32% involve firearm drawn, and then head displacement. So you see some similar trends, but you continue to see these pieces as more highly represented, right? And the tracer data. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Does anyone have any questions about the numbers before I share a little bit more about the tracers?
I want to name that we have about 15 minutes left of our meeting, that we need to make space in that time for whatever else you need to share, and public comment, and a note about themes from listening, and a note about recommendations.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of stuff. Just think about that as you continue to share.
So to think about, I'll end here with just saying, to sharing some of the beginnings of my themes that I'm identifying around the use of force data, since we don't have time to really discuss it more. Would that be helpful, just to sort of share with you the themes I'm identifying through the tracers and the data itself? The tracers are so illuminating. They give so much information about what's actually happening, certainly from the officer's perspective themselves, because that's the reports that we're reading. But it gives a lot of information about what's going on behind those numbers, right? And so the themes that I've identified so far within that use of force data that need to be addressed are, the biggest strength I can see is the lack of the use of firearms in the last 2 years. That is what I will say about strengths for now. That the time in many of these cases, and I will be figuring out the average, but in many of the cases that I reviewed, from the response time to the completion of the case itself, was relatively short, 45 minutes sometimes, So questions about the use of other de-escalation strategies. Of course, every situation is different, but for example, in situations where there's no charge or there's suicidality, the length of time that folks are spending in that space, I think needs to be discussed. The use of training and expertise as justification for use of force. This is something that I think needs to be considered when we talk about training, right? There's some statements in the reports that say things like, I know through training that people experiencing a mental health crisis can be violent and unpredictable, right? So how is training getting applied and used as a justification for the use of force, right? The insufficient use of and/or documentation of de-escalation techniques. Also, insufficient attempts to engage other or more appropriate supports, which includes accessibility and communication supports for people who might be deaf or have other communication needs. Lack of attunement to police presence and use of force as to intimidate as an escalation technique. So this, we spoke earlier about the presence of the police actually escalating a situation and then force being used against somebody, right? And then the traumatic impact of use of coercion, intimidation, and force. And there's some really strong evidence of this, even in the police reports that they write themselves of the use of force documents. And lack of accountability in use of force cases. The use of defending self and restraining subject for own safety as the action or the reason for the use of force. And again, the lack of any community accountability or assessment around the use of force in the current structure. And I apologize for taking up so much time, and I'm grateful that y'all
No, we need to hear it.
Space. Yeah.
We need to hear from this work that you've been holding. It's huge.
I have so many clarifying questions, but I know we don't have time.
Yeah. You're welcome to email me, email us questions at the CSRT at Proton Mail. And that includes the public. I'll put the email in. And your questions, if I can't answer them right away, can absolutely be incorporated into the report itself as further inquiry that needs to happen. So please don't withhold your questions if you have any.
We have something in the chat.
Yeah, Malika is sharing, just in case people don't know, there's so much force used in the ER, at the retreat, in disability services, and in the schools. Yeah. And another thing about the ER is that the ER has their own, some of the ER tracers show too that the police are at times being called because they legally can use force, right? The ER has a security staff, right? And there are times indicated in the tracers where the sole reason that the hospital is calling is to get help with putting hands on somebody to bring them back into the hospital, as an example.
And though there's plenty to talk about the role of involuntary hospitalization, some of the force that's happening at the hospital is for voluntary hospitalization as well. So what that looks like is a person goes because there's nowhere else to go in our community, because they're having a really hard time. And then if they want to leave, even though they walked themselves there, the police have been called in to stop that person from walking home.
Yeah. And more.
There, and more. And I just point that out as a theme, because that's in the listening data. In the listening portion, that's a huge theme. Can I share some themes for a moment, Emily?
Yes, please.
And then I'll talk about the areas of recommendation. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Screen. Does this work? So I'm gonna show you this. Can you all see my screen?
No.
How about now? Damn it. I mean, darn it. Shoot. Shucks. All right, well, I'll just read it to you then, which is fine. I'm going to read you some themes. Themes from listening. So I want to just tell you a little bit about the structure for a moment. The structure of the listening information is going to be like this, unless you all tell me that this is horrible. Strengths. What is happening in our community that's supporting people's safety? Threats. What are threats to people's safety? Experiences with police, the mental health system, and the child protective system. And visions or solutions that community members have. Those are the 5 areas of inquiry that our collectively generated survey questions essentially ask. Within each of those, we're looking at a breakdown, a racial breakdown, and then also like other affected communities, right? So like neurodivergent, psychiatrically labeled people's perspectives about how the mental health system is going for them is extremely relevant, right? So within that, I just want to say that the biggest strengths total in the community that people named supported their safety were friends, family, and organic networks of support overwhelmingly. Also, those networks being resourced well. Also, this review project. Also, the presence of the Root Social Justice Center and its programs. Financial security and basic needs met without struggle. Shelter, housing for all. Outdoor spaces and exercise and physical wellness practices. Mutual aid networks, and the general concept that my boat rises when the tide rises of all those around me, and that when my community is well, I'm well. Those are the things that total respondents named supported their safety. But there are some themes that came out of that I just want to share really briefly that broke down among Black respondents, which again isn't necessarily representative of the entire community, but there were many responses from people of color, Black people in particularly, that said, this is a hard question to answer. What is working well for community safety is a difficult and painful question to answer was the biggest theme in that listening. The presence of the Root Social Justice Center and its programs, POC and BIPOC community, family, friends, and this effort were other themes in what supports community safety for Black folks and non-Black people of color, or non-Black specified people of color. Someone could have said mixed race. I put that in non-Black specified people of color because they didn't specify. But they could be also a Black person. Among queer and trans people, the presence of the Root, friends and family, this effort, and queer competent providers of support were the biggest strengths. Among people with DCF involvement, again, it was a really painful question to be asked, but also the Root was named as the biggest strength. Amongst white folks, friends, family, this project, and outdoor activity and self-care and things like that were pretty big themes. Threats, overwhelmingly for total respondents, systemic racism and white supremacy were the biggest threat to community safety for all respondents. Police and policing was number 2. Opiates and addiction was number 3, essentially. And it's not quantifiable, but I've combed the data many times and tried to mark the approximate amount that people were naming different things. And we didn't seed these categories. These are just self-generated categories that I then categorized. There was no multiple choice. Amongst all people, also classism, poverty, racism within local government, and lack of adequate mental health and addiction supports were named. Amongst Black folks, white supremacy and racism, police and policing, racism within the select board and local government, classism and anti-poor policies, and lack of adequate supports for people in struggle, or the inability to call for help in struggle, largely due to racism and policing, were the biggest threats to safety. That was consistent with Black folks. And just a moment, sorry, someone just tried to come into my space. Amongst folks who are mentally ill, psychiatrically labeled, psychiatrically disabled, systemic racism, policing, mental health system harms, and the retreat were the biggest threats to community safety. There's many other categories of people, but that's the only folks that broke from the larger pattern were folks who shared no relevant ID, who did not name racism as primary as opiates and addiction, and poverty and crime and break-ins. Police and policing, a lot of people who have no significant interaction feel like most of their interactions have been really good. Also, an equivalently high theme is that policing is systemically racist. The next kind of strongest theme that emerged was that we need alternatives, and many people specified that we need to use police resources for those alternatives, and some people just said we need alternatives. Many people named that policing feels like a threat to them, that they avoid police, that they have fear or PTSD responses around police, and that folks have experienced police racism and profiling in Brattleboro. Amongst Black and non-Black POC community, the top feelings and experiences around policing were that policing happens in a racist way, that people have personally experienced police racism or profiling in Brattleboro, and that they're unable to call police for support. And amongst queer folks, there were really similar themes: avoidance, fear, systemically racist, can't call them for help, can't use other services that use police for help, and we need alternatives. And many people specified that they want to defund the police to have those alternatives. And some people just named that we need alternatives. Among survivors of violence, alternatives are needed, that they had trauma reactions from their experience, that the situation was dishonest or manipulated, that it's not a complete solve for domestic violence or is ineffective for domestic violence, or that it's a threat to the person experiencing violence. And there are many other categories of people, but those are some. Amongst white folks, appropriate, doing good, no significant interaction. There was also like my experiences have been appropriate and good, and I have significant interaction, and that was a smaller category. Fear, systemically racist, and we need to provide alternatives. Avoidance, ineffectiveness for domestic violence, and alternatives needed were some of the biggest themes from that. I want to say that there's that type of data for also the mental health system and DCF to paint with a broader brush. Most categories of community members want there to be alternatives that are less carceral for mental health, more voluntary, more truly voluntary, that won't turn into involuntary, that are alternatives to the ER and the retreat, which people have experienced great harm largely inside of in mental health responses. Around DCF, the information around DCF was the most consistent across all people who responded, which was DCF is traumatizing, damaging, took autonomy away from youth who responded, who had DCF involvement, and we need alternatives to DCF, where it was really strong themes around that. Solutions are the most all over the map. Predictably to me, solutions and visions are the place where there's the most variance. Some folks, mostly people who did not share any identifiers, feel like their policing at its current level or more would be helpful, but the total respondents felt like housing for all, people's basic needs getting met without struggle, and being safe no matter your identity, and ending racism, and getting better mental health and addiction supports that more people can access were the strongest themes amongst all respondents. And also government reflecting the needs of people, government better listening to communities about what they need and allowing communities to lead themselves, and funding programs by and for communities from themselves as safety support was the strongest themes of solutions and visions. So allow Black community to decide what safety means to Black community and fund what that means. Allow queer folks to name what safety looks like to them and support those projects and missions. Those were the strongest themes from solutions and visions, and lots of things about what alternatives could look like. So that transitions us at 8:01 to 4 areas of possible recommendation to talk about on Wednesday. 1, acknowledging harm. This is a proposal. You all can think about it. We'll talk about it on Wednesday. 1, acknowledging harm. Could look a lot of ways. We get to talk about it. 2, increased accountability.
And community control.
Could look a lot of ways, and we get to talk about it. 3, alternatives. Build alternatives and fill the gaps. Alternatives, not a one-to-one, not like instead of police responding in a carceral way to suicidality, someone else needs to respond in a carceral way to suicidality, but alternative supports that actually meet folks' needs. And 4, reduce police contact in the areas in which they are experienced as the most harmful right now, as a start. those are the areas of general recommendations that Emily and I are thinking about. And on Wednesday, we would love to talk more about some of our ideas about the specifics of what that could look like and hear from you all, both to like challenge and or support those things. And also if you have other ideas about those things, but generally acknowledge the harm of some of these systems and the ways that they have historically and currently are happening, because you can't be accountable until you acknowledge what's happening. That's how accountability works. Increase accountability, build up alternatives for the people who can't access current systems, and reduce contact in the areas where it's currently the most harmful. Those are the areas we're thinking about. You all can bring
overarching categories in that order that we're talking about. And so what we want to do is share that with you all now so that you have some time to marinate on what that lands for you, so that we're ready to jump off in 2 days. Discussing further.
Have you identified the areas that, based on your findings, where policing is causing the most harm and the recommendation potentially to remove some of that based on the listening sessions, or? Okay.
It would be based on a combination of listening to people, listening to the police review, and listening to organizations about what's possible in terms of, what do people in the mental health system and people who support folks who are experiencing homelessness feel like are areas of wiggle room or areas of possibility. And
we have begun to formulate from all the data that we've shared with you so far, and like more data, but we've shared with you the biggest stuff, right? We have started to formulate the major findings, right? Like articulate the major findings from the listening data and the police review data of where the strengths are, right? And also where the major areas of harm are, right? And so I think maybe, Shay, if you agree, we can kick off our next conversation clarifying that in more like articulation of what the major findings are, as we also then clarify more specifically what might be under the subcategories of those recommendations. Yeah. And both of those are up for discussion with you all, right? The major findings and the major recommendations.
We can, and I also will say, our draft report, which is nowhere near done, is already 40 pages long, and I have, 80 pages of unused quotes from people's responses that we're not going to include even nearly all of it all, but there's more to wade through than we can wade through in a committee process, which is why we designed this part so that Emily and I would be really writing a lot, and then we're going to bring back just the biggest parts that we can to this space and pass it around and hear your really big feelings and feedback and use that as a rudder, right? But we're going to have to hold a lot of that still, because there's just so much to wade through in that information. So we can bring you back the biggest themes, which I feel like I've done it twice now. Bring back the biggest themes from listening data. A theme that I haven't shared with you all is, because it's harder to de-identify, frankly, is the listening that I've done with organizations. That's just going to be more of like a block analysis of how that ecosystem of support works, because I can't say a top leader in the only psychiatric institution in our community that does inpatient treatment said it's not de-identifiable, right? So that's just going to be more of an analysis that's in there about like where possibilities are. And I can share a little bit of that with you, but you have a lot of the themes from listening already. You maybe can hear more major findings from the police review side. And then we really, I think, need to flesh out, make it or break it with you all about these sort of areas of recommendation, which largely are going to include further work. So there's also some wiggle room there. But I think there's a few things that do feel clear. Like there is disparity in how people are experiencing these systems, and there is a need to stop harm from happening. Those are very clear to me from where I'm sitting holding all these people's truths. And so we get to talk about that the next time, and then we get to keep, and maybe we say we need to keep doing work together or another round of work to land on some things. But I hope that we can have at least a few recommendations that are fairly clear that we have enough agreement about to move forward. That's my hope. And it's a wacky timeline. And if we can't, all get to as far as I dream. I fully understand that, but 2 meetings the week of some major holidays is quite a lot, right on the deadline. And I'm so appreciative for you all and all that you've contributed to the process and the ideas and the direction and the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
Do we still have time to ask the public if they just want to talk for a
Yes.
minute or something? Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you, Lana, for bringing us there. And
As long as
apologies.
folks can stick around.
Right. And apologies to the public for not having space earlier. But if anybody does want to share or ask a question, again, you're welcome to email us directly if you have questions or something you want to offer. But now is also available if you'd like to raise your blue hand or put something in the chat. And while we're waiting to see if anyone does have questions and wants to raise their hand, I'll just bring attention to the chat and say thanks to Maya for correcting herself. Earlier, she had shared that the Burlington Police Department made approximately 1,600 arrests in 2019 out of 28,000 calls, which is actually 5.7%, not 17%. So,
Also note that Brattleboro local government really dislikes being compared to Burlington. Apples and oranges, find a community our size, please, is a common refrain I've heard in that space. So we can do some more work about control communities if we need that. But
I was also
bet
going to say someone should recheck that if you're going to use it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any comments before we end? And Laura, were you able to get, and we can add it into the notes, but I do mostly want y'all to marinate on, definitely the themes that I have shared through the data and that Shay has shared, but the beginnings of the formulation of those categories of recommendations so that you can start thinking about what's come up for you, what's felt most present for you in this process, and where that might fit as well in those recommendations.
Yeah, those are in the notes for people to read over, and I definitely appreciate everything, all the work and everything you shared. It's a lot, and it feels good to have the next couple of days to just think more about everything that came up tonight.
Thank you.
Agreed.
So for the public to know, we will be meeting in 2 days, 2 evenings.
Off of our regular schedule.
Yeah.
Extra.
And I do believe that tomorrow the select board will be meeting and there'll be some discussion about the police budget if I remember correctly. But Wednesday, the 23rd, 6 to 8, we will have another special committee meeting because as you can see, we have a lot to discuss. Bob.
I just put a question in the chat. Did you get access to the COSU listening session report? And did you read that?
Do you mean listening session from what do you mean when you say the COSU listening session?
COSU did a listening session and they recently compiled a report. And I'm wondering if you had access to that. I'll
You mean the listening session around closing the medicated assisted treatment programs?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, I haven't read that report yet, but I did know that listening session was happening, and I'm happy to engage with that before our final deadline.
So you have that?
We don't have access to that, but I think we can get it real easily.
Okay. Yeah.
Great.
Drift, did you want to say something? Oh no, that was Bob. I see on the phone. Sorry. All right. Thanks all for going a little bit further over our time, and please take good care of yourselves. And thank you so much for all of this, for just showing up and being here for this. And we'll see you in a couple of days.
Happy solstice, everyone.
Yes. Happy solstice to you.
Happy solstice.